Welcome back to the deep dive. Looks like we've gotten a bunch of questions about lung cancer lately. You guys really want to dig into this one.
Yeah, it's a hot topic. And for good reason, I think.
Definitely. And we've got some great material to work with. This article from the Advocate Voice, their lung cancer guide for 2024, looks really comprehensive.
It does. Seems very up to date, too.
Yeah, so let's dive into it. Today we're going to try to unpack the latest on lung cancer. You know what you need to know. Symptoms, risk factors, new treatments, the whole shebang.
The whole 9 yards, yeah.
And luckily, we've got expert speaker here to help us make sense of it all, give us the big picture.
Happy to help connect the dots.
So one thing that jumped out at me right away from this article is how they talk about lung cancer increasing, even in people who don't smoke. Kind of alarming, right?
It is a concerning trend, for sure, especially for women, actually.
Yeah, the article mentioned that too. And it sounds like researchers are still
Yeah.
trying to figure out exactly why that is.
They are. Smoking is still the biggest risk factor, obviously. But this rise in non-smokers, it's something we need to understand better.
Makes you realize that lung cancer can affect anyone, not just smokers. Yeah, so
Exactly. And it highlights why it's so crucial to know the warning signs, even if you think you're not at risk.
right, because the article listed those classic symptoms, the cough that won't quit, chest pain, all that.
Yeah.
But there were some less obvious ones, too, that kind of surprised me.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Like hoarseness, for one, or even shoulder pain, arm pain. Who would think that's connected to your lungs?
It's not always intuitive. And then you've got things like fatigue, unexplained weight loss, even getting infections more often.
Easy to dismiss those as just being run down or whatever, but they could be signs of something more serious.
Right. And that's exactly why early detection is so important with this.
So bottom line for our listeners,
Yeah.
any of these weird symptoms hanging around, should they be calling their doctor?
I'd always say it's better to be safe than sorry, especially if you got any of the risk factors like smoking or if lung cancer runs in the family. Your doctor can figure out if you need tests or anything.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk risk factors. Beyond smoking, I mean, the article is clear. Smoking causes the VAST majority of lung cancer cases, something like 80 to 90%.
It's huge, yeah. But even if you don't smoke, you're not totally off the hook. Secondhand smoke, that's a major risk too.
They called it a silent threat in the article, kind of scary.
It is. You're breathing in all those same carcinogens as the smoker. Over time, it can really increase your risk.
And then there's this thing called radon. Gotta admit, I wasn't super familiar with this before.
It's sneaky radon, naturally occurring radioactive gas, and it's actually the second leading cause of lung cancer.
Whoa, seriously. After smoking.
Yep. And you might not even know you're exposed. No smell, no color.
The article said it can seep into homes from the ground. How do you even know if that's a problem for you?
Well, you can test for it. Home radon test kits. They're pretty easy to find and not expensive. The EPA actually recommends testing, especially in certain areas where radon levels are higher.
Good to know. So we've got smoking, secondhand smoke, radon. And then the article also lists things like asbestos exposure and air pollution as risk factors.
Yeah, those environmental factors are important too. Asbestos, we know that's bad news. Used to be in tons of building materials, and long-term exposure to polluted air, that can definitely increase your risk too.
And of course, there's always family history and genetics. The article mentions specific gene mutations that can raise your risk even if you've never smoked.
Right, that's the tricky part, isn't it? Some of this stuff you can't control.
Feels like a lot of it is out of our hands. So what's the most important thing our listener can take away from all this, given what they've sent us?
I think the biggest takeaway is that even though we can't change our genes or our family history, we do have some control. We can make choices that reduce our exposure to those other risks, the ones we can do something about.
So focusing on what's within our control, even if there are some things we can't change. I like that.
Exactly. Gives you a sense of agency, you know? You're not just helpless.
Okay, so let's move on to diagnosis. Seems like it's not just about chest x-rays anymore, huh?
Definitely not. Things have come a long way. We've got much better tools for finding lung cancer early, which is obviously key.
The article mentioned x-rays, but it seems like CT scans are becoming the go-to, especially for people who are considered high risk.
Yeah, CT scans are much more detailed. They give you a 3D view so you can spot those tiny nodules that might be cancer.
And what happens if they find something suspicious on the scan?
Well, then they usually do a biopsy. That's the only way to know for sure if it's cancer and what type it is.
Right, because the article talked about different types of biopsies. Needle biopsies, bronchoscopy. even some less invasive options.
Yeah, there are a few ways to get a tissue sample. It depends on the situation, the location of the nodule, things like that.
It's good that technology is making these procedures less scary, right?
Definitely. And then you've got those high-tech tools like PD scans. Those are pretty amazing. They can actually highlight cancer cells.
So they basically light up the trouble spots, huh?
Yep, pretty much. And then we've got molecular and genetic testing. These tests are getting more and more important for figuring out the best treatment for each patient.
Personalized medicine, right?
Exactly. It's all about understanding the specific characteristics of your cancer so you can target it more effectively.
And then there was this thing about liquid biopsy that blew my mind. They can detect cancer with just a blood test now.
It's still fairly new, but yeah, liquid biopsy is showing a lot of promise. Might not completely replace traditional biopsies yet, but it's definitely a game changer.
That's wild. It seems like we've come so far in terms of how we diagnose lung cancer. But what about treatment? Is it still all about slash, poison, burn?
Thankfully, no, we've moved beyond that. While surgery, chemo, and radiation are still part of the picture, we're combining those with newer, more targeted therapies. They're less toxic and more effective.
That's great to hear. So is surgery still common for lung cancer?
It is, especially if the cancer is caught early, before it has a chance to spread. Removing the tumor surgically can actually cure you in those cases.
And the article talked about different types of surgery, like lobectomy and pneumonectomy. What's the difference?
A lobectomy, that's where they remove just the lobe of the lung where the tumor is. Pneumonectomy is removing the whole lung.
Sounds intense.
Yeah.
I imagine recovery from those surgeries can be tough.
It can be, especially for people who've smoked for a long time. But newer surgical techniques are making it easier, less invasive, faster recovery.
That's good to know. And then there's chemotherapy. A lot of people associate that with really harsh side effects, right?
Chemo is still a powerful tool, but yeah, the side effects can be rough. The good news is we're getting much better at managing those side effects.
So less of a one-size-fits-all approach and more tailored to the individual.
Exactly. We can personalize chemo regimens now to minimize those side effects as much as possible.
What about radiation? How's that fit in?
Radiation uses high-energy rays to kill cancer cells. It can be a primary treatment, or it can be used to shrink tumors before or after surgery, and sometimes it's used to help relieve symptoms in advanced cases.
Lots of different ways to use it depending on the situation.
Exactly. And like with chemo, the technology's gotten a lot better. We can target radiation much more precisely now, which helps spare healthy tissue and reduce side effects.
But the part that really got me excited was the stuff about targeted therapies. The article described them as attacking the cancer at its root.
Targeted therapies are a big deal. We're talking about drugs that are designed to go after specific vulnerabilities in cancer cells based on their genetic mutations. It's like a guided missile zeroing in on the enemy.
So much more precise than traditional chemo, which just kind of attacks everything.
Right. And because they're so targeted, they tend to have fewer side effects. That's a win-win.
Wow, this is amazing stuff. Feels like science fiction is becoming reality.
It really is an incredible time for cancer research. The progress we're making, it's truly remarkable. We're moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach towards personalized medicine that's tailored to each individual patient.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of the basics here, but I'm really curious to dig into those cutting-edge treatments you mentioned.
Gene therapy, immunotherapy, CRR T-cell therapy. We'll get into all that after the break. Stay with us. It's mind-blowing, isn't it, how fast things are changing in lung cancer treatment.
It really is. Feels like a whole new era is just beginning. Before we went to break, you mentioned some amazing things. Gene therapy, immunotherapy, even CAR T-cell therapy. Honestly, some of that stuff sounds pretty sci-fi to me. Could you break it down for our listeners, like in plain English?
Sure, let's try. So gene therapy, that's all about actually modifying the genes within the cancer cells themselves. You're basically trying to reprogram them, stop them from growing and spreading.
So like going into the source code of the cancer and rewriting it.
Exactly. One technique they're using is called CRISPR. You might have heard of it. CRISPR is like a pair of molecular scissors. It can cut and edit DNA with crazy precision. Researchers are figuring out how to use that to target the specific mutations that are driving the lung cancer.
So it's not just killing the cancer cells, you're actually trying to change how they behave.
Yeah, that's the idea. Another approach is called RNA interference, RNAi. This one works by silencing specific genes that are involved in cancer growth, like hitting the mute button on those bad genes.
Wow, that's wild. But is any of this actually working? Are we seeing results with these gene therapy approaches?
It's still early days, to be honest, but the initial research is promising. I think gene therapy has huge potential, especially when you combine it with other treatments.
Okay, so gene therapy is all about manipulating those cancer cells directly. What about immunotherapy and CAR T-cell therapy? Those seem to be taking a different angle, right?
Right. Immunotherapy is all about harnessing the power of your own immune system to fight the cancer, your body's natural defenses.
Makes sense. So how does that work?
Well, CAR T-cell therapy is one type of immunotherapy. It's pretty complex, but basically they take T cells from your blood.
Yeah.
Those are a type of white blood cell that's really important for immunity.
Okay, got it. T-cells.
So they take these T cells and they genetically engineer them in a lab. They add these special receptors called CARs, chimeric antigen receptors.
Catchy name.
I know, right? But these CARs are basically like homing devices. They allow the T cells to recognize and target specific proteins that are found on the surface of cancer cells.
So you're basically giving your immune system a boost, and you're pointing it in the right direction, like go get those cancer cells.
You got it. Once the T cells have been engineered, they multiply them in the lab and then they infuse them back into the patient. And then those T cells, they go on a search and destroy mission, hunting down cancer cells throughout the body.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
But the article mentioned some challenges with CAR T-cell therapy in lung cancer specifically, right? What were those?
Well, the main challenge is that lung cancer is a solid tumor. Solid tumors, they create a tough environment for those engineered T cells to get into to reach all the cancer cells. It's different with blood cancers, where CAR T-cell therapy has been incredibly successful.
So it's like those T-cells are trying to fight their way through a jungle instead of an open field.
Perfect analogy. But don't worry, researchers are working on it. They're developing these things called bispecific CAR T cells. They can target multiple proteins on the tumor cells, which makes them more effective against those solid tumors.
So giving them a more detailed map of the jungle and better weapons to fight with once they're in there.
Exactly. And the potential here is enormous. CAR T-cell therapy for lung cancer, it's a really hot area of research. I'm optimistic about what the future holds.
This is all very exciting, but let's bring it back down to earth for a second. For people who are living with lung cancer right now, how is all this stuff like precision medicine changing the game for them?
Good point. So precision medicine, that's all about tailoring the treatment to the individual patient. It starts with molecular testing, remember that. They analyze the genes of your tumor to figure out which mutations are driving its growth. It's like getting a blueprint of your enemy.
So instead of just giving everyone the same treatment, it's more personalized, right?
Exactly. And the article highlighted how targeted therapies, those drugs that are designed to go after specific mutations, they're a key part of precision medicine.
They mentioned EGFR inhibitors and ALK inhibitors in the article. Those are examples of targeted therapies, right?
They are. These drugs basically block the signals that tell cancer cells to grow and divide. Much more targeted than traditional chemo, which just kind of attacks all rapidly dividing cells, including the healthy ones.
So less collateral damage with these targeted therapies.
That's the idea. That's why they tend to have fewer side effects. They're more focused on just the cancer cells, leaving the healthy cells alone as much as possible.
That's great. But all these promising new therapies, how do they actually become available to patients? I remember that the article talked about clinical trials being really important.
Clinical trials are essential. That's how we test new drugs and treatments to make sure they're safe and effective.
It's like a proving ground for these cutting-edge treatments.
Yeah.
They have to pass a bunch of tests before they can be used more widely.
Right. And for people with advanced lung cancer or cancers that are hard to treat, participating in a clinical trial can give them access to these new therapies that aren't available to the public yet.
The article mentioned different phases of clinical trials. Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3. What do those even mean?
Phase 1 trials, those are mainly about safety, figuring out the right dose of the drug and identifying any potential side effects. Phase 2 is about effectiveness. Does the drug actually work against the cancer? And then Phase 3, that's where they compare the new treatment to the standard treatment to see which one is better.
So a step-by-step process to make sure the new treatments are safe and effective before they're released to everyone.
Exactly. And there are also programs for compassionate use. Those allow patients who don't qualify for a clinical trial to get access to experimental treatments if there are no other options.
It seems like there are more options now than ever before for people with lung cancer.
There are. It's really encouraging. But the article also talked about artificial intelligence and big data. They're playing a role in this too, right?
AI and big data, it's everywhere these days. What are they doing for lung cancer?
Well, AI is being used to analyze scans, like CT scans and X-rays, to detect those tiny lung nodules that might be cancerous. AI can often do this even better than humans.
Wow, so it's like having another set of eyes, superpowered eyes looking at your scans.
Exactly. And AI can also help personalize treatment plans. By crunching massive amounts of data, AI algorithms can predict which treatments are most likely to be effective for you based on the specifics of your tumor and your genes.
Take some of the guesswork out of it. What about big data? How does that fit in?
Big data is about analyzing huge amounts of information like medical records, genetic data, treatment outcomes, to find patterns and trends that you wouldn't be able to see with smaller amounts of data.
Like looking for a needle in a haystack, but the haystack is made of information.
That's one way to put it. And those patterns, they can help researchers understand lung cancer better, find new risk factors, and develop better treatments.
Okay, so we've been talking about a lot of theoretical stuff, but did the article give any real-world examples of how these new therapies are actually helping patients?
Yes, they had a couple of really inspiring patient stories.
I love a good success story. Tell me about them.
So one was about a woman named Jane. She had advanced non-small cell lung cancer. And through molecular testing, they found out she had this rare ALK mutation. So they put her in a clinical trial for a drug that targets that specific mutation. And within a few months, her tumors shrank dramatically. She was able to go back to work. Her quality of life improved so much. She's been in remission for 3 years now.
That's amazing. It shows how powerful these targeted therapies can be. What was the other story?
This one was about a man named Michael. He had stage IV lung cancer. He enrolled in a trial for a type of immunotherapy, PD-L1 therapy, which helps boost the immune system. And because of that treatment, his tumors shrunk. He was able to spend more time with his family. It gave him a new sense of hope.
Those are incredible stories. Really brings it home. It's not just abstract science, it's real people's lives being changed.
Exactly. And even though lung cancer is still a very serious disease, there's so much to be hopeful about. The progress we've made, the research that's happening right now, it's remarkable.
Feels like the future of lung cancer treatment is really bright.
It is. We're moving beyond just treating the symptoms. We're starting to see real possibilities for cures, especially with these new therapies.
Okay, so we've talked about all this cutting-edge stuff, but let's shift gears a bit and talk about what our listener can do to protect themselves right here, right now. What are the practical things people can do to reduce their risk of getting lung cancer in the first place?
That's a great question. Prevention is always the best medicine, and we've touched on some of this already, but it's worth repeating.
Absolutely. So what's the number one thing people can do?
Quit smoking. If you smoke, quit. And if you don't smoke, don't start. I know it's not easy, but it's the single most important thing you can do to protect yourself from lung cancer. And there's more help available now than ever before to help people quit.
The article also talked about minimizing exposure to secondhand smoke, right?
Right. Secondhand smoke is just as dangerous as smoking yourself.
And then there's that radon thing. Not something most people think about, but sounds like we should.
Definitely. Radon, it's sneaky. You can't see it. You can't smell it. But it can be deadly.
So what can people do about it?
Test your home. It's easy and inexpensive. Home test kits are available at most hardware stores. If your levels are high, there are systems you can install to get rid of the radon.
So no smoking, avoid secondhand smoke, test for radon. Anything else people can do to protect their lungs?
Well, the article also mentioned minimizing exposure to other environmental hazards like asbestos and air pollution.
Asbestos? That stuff is scary.
It is. If you live in an older home, there's a chance there might be asbestos lurking in the walls or insulation. It's a good idea to have it checked out, and if they find any, have it professionally removed.
What about air pollution? That seems harder to avoid, especially if you live in a city.
It can be tough to avoid completely, but you can check air quality reports and try to limit your time outdoors when the air is bad. You can also wear a mask if you have to be out in polluted areas and use air purifiers in your home.
So it's about being aware and taking steps to protect yourself.
Exactly. And don't forget the basics: healthy diet, regular exercise, managing stress. All of that contributes to a healthy immune system, which is your best defense against any disease.
It's all connected, isn't it? But even if you do everything right, there's still a chance you might get lung cancer. That's why screening is so important.
Absolutely. Screening can catch it early when it's most treatable. The article recommended annual low-dose CT scans for people over 50 who have a history of smoking.
Those scans can pick up lung cancer when it's still tiny.
Right. And that early detection, it makes a huge difference in the success of the treatment.
So what happens if someone does get a lung cancer diagnosis? What can they expect? It must be a lot to process.
It is. It's a life-changing event. But the important thing is to remember that you're not alone. There's support out there.
And to reach out for that support.
Exactly. Talk to your loved ones, your friends, a therapist. There are support groups too, both online and in person, where you can connect with other people who understand what you're going through.
Having that sense of community, knowing you're not alone in this, it can make a world of difference.
It really can. The article also emphasized self-care. Simple things like eating well, getting some exercise, and managing fatigue, those can make a big difference in how you cope with treatment.
And of course, there's the financial aspect of cancer treatment. That can be a huge burden on top of everything else.
It's true, cancer treatment can be very expensive, but the article pointed out that there are resources to help people manage those costs. Financial aid programs, insurance options, nonprofit organizations that offer assistance.
So even though a lung cancer diagnosis is scary, it's not the end of the world. There are ways to navigate the challenges and find the support you need.
Absolutely. And the article actually ended with a list of organizations that provide reliable information and support for patients and families.
We'll definitely make sure to include those links in the show notes for our listeners.
Perfect. Those resources can be incredibly helpful. They can answer your questions, connect you with support, and guide you through the process.
This has been such an informative deep dive. We started out feeling a bit overwhelmed by all the information, but now I'm feeling more hopeful and empowered.
I'm glad to hear that. Knowledge is power. And now our listeners have a much better understanding of lung cancer. The causes, the symptoms, the treatment options, and most importantly, the resources available to help them through this journey.
So as we wrap up, what's the final thought you want to leave our listeners with? Something they can ponder as they continue to learn about this topic.
I think the biggest takeaway is this. With all the advances we're seeing, lung cancer doesn't have to be a death sentence anymore. In many cases, it can be a manageable condition. The key is awareness, early action, and getting the best possible care.
That's a powerful message. And for our listeners, we want to emphasize that you are now more informed than ever to make decisions about your health. Knowledge is power.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep advocating for your well-being.
That's a great place to end. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure. It's been great talking about this important topic.
And to our listeners, thank you for sharing your curiosity with us. We've included links to all the resources we talked about in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. Okay, so we've really gone deep on this one, haven't we? Covered a ton of ground on lung cancer, from those breakthrough treatments to all the risk factors and even, the emotional side of things. What it's like to actually live with this diagnosis.
It's been a lot, yeah. But I think it's all been really important. Hopefully our listeners are walking away feeling more informed, like they've got a handle on this stuff.
I hope so too. But now I want to kind of bring it all together. Like, what can our listener actually do with all this information?
Good point. Let's talk about action steps.
All right, so way back at the beginning, we talked about how lung cancer isn't just a smoker's disease anymore. That's kind of scary, right? The article talked about those rising cases in people who've never smoked, especially women.
Right, and that's why it's so crucial to think about all the risk factors, not just smoking.
So, first things first, what should our listener do to figure out their own personal risk?
Well, I think the first step is just to be honest with yourself. Look at those risk factors we talked about. Your smoking history. Have you been exposed to secondhand smoke? Radon? Asbestos? What about air pollution? All those things play a role.
And let's say our listener realizes, uh-oh, I've got some of those red flags. What should they do next?
Don't wait. Talk to your doctor. Be proactive. Tell them your concerns. Ask about getting screened, especially if lung cancer runs in your family or if you have any of those other risk factors.
We talked about those low-dose CT scans being a really good way to catch it early. Who should be getting those specifically?
The guidelines right now recommend them for people who are 50 to 80 years old and who have a history of heavy smoking, like a pack a day for 20 years or something equivalent to that.
And even if you've quit smoking, you should probably still talk to your doctor about getting screened, right?
Exactly, especially if you quit somewhat recently, like within the past 15 years.
Early detection, it really is the key, isn't it?
It makes a huge difference. Finding lung cancer early, before it has time to spread, that's when treatment is most likely to be successful.
So it's about being proactive, taking charge of your own lung health. But even if you do everything right, there's still a chance you might get that diagnosis. And that's got to be tough.
It is. It's a scary thing to hear. But remember, there's help out there. You don't have to go through this alone.
You mentioned some really great organizations earlier, the ones that provide support and information for patients and their families.
Yeah, those resources are invaluable. They can hook you up with support groups, financial aid, all kinds of things.
We'll be sure to include those links in the show notes so our listeners can find them.
Perfect. They can really be a lifeline for people who are trying to figure out what to do next?
And it's not just about the practical stuff either, right? There's that whole emotional side to dealing with a cancer diagnosis. We talked about that too.
Absolutely. It's a lot to deal with emotionally, but it's so important to allow yourself to feel those feelings, the fear, the sadness, the anger, whatever comes up for you. Don't try to bottle it up.
And reach out to people, right?
Yeah, talk to your loved ones, your friends. Find a therapist if that's helpful for you. Support groups are great too. Being able to connect with other people who get it, who are going through the same thing, it can really make a difference.
Having that sense of community can make you feel less alone, less isolated.
Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of self-care either. Taking care of yourself physically and emotionally, eating well, getting a little bit of exercise if you can, even just resting when you need to, all of that can help you cope with the treatment and maintain your quality of life.
Yeah, we talked about how those simple things can actually have a big impact. But let's not forget, amidst all the challenges, there's also a lot of hope here. The article talked about some pretty incredible advances in treatment. Gene therapy, immunotherapy, CRR, T-cell therapy, all that stuff.
It's really remarkable. These new therapies are giving people hope who, just a few years ago, might not have had any.
It feels like we're on the verge of a real revolution in how we treat cancer.
I think so too. It's a really exciting time to be working in this field. There's so much happening, so much progress being made.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with that sense of hope. Lung cancer is serious, yes, but it's not an automatic death sentence anymore. With awareness, early detection, and the best possible care, there's a real chance for a long and healthy life.
I agree. And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about this disease, the more you can take control of your own health and your own destiny.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
This deep dive has been a real learning experience, and I hope it's been the same for our listeners. We've covered a lot of ground, from the science to the human stories, and I think we're all walking away from this feeling a little bit more informed and a little bit more empowered.
That's what we were going for.
And to our listeners, thank you for being here with us, for sharing your curiosity, for asking those tough questions. We've included links to all those resources we talked about in the show notes, so make sure you check those out. And until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep. We'll see you soon.